I remember that Tuesday night vividly, because it started with the kind of aggressive, heavy rain that makes you feel like the world is shrinking down to just the four walls of your house. I was sitting at my mahogany desk in the corner of the den, the blue light of my dual monitors casting long, distorted shadows against the bookshelves that line the far wall. The house is an old ranch-style place on the outskirts of town, sitting on a plot of land that's mostly overgrown oak trees and thick brush, which I usually find peaceful. My cat Jasper was curled into a tight orange ball on the rug near the radiator, his ears twitching every time the wind sent a spray of water against the window pane with a sharp, metallic sound. I was deep into a spreadsheet for work, the kind of soul-crushing data entry that requires total focus just to keep from going numb. The atmosphere was almost cozy in a lonely sort of way, with the rhythmic tapping of the rain providing a white noise that helped me ignore the silence of the rest of the house. I remember thinking how lucky I was to be inside, warm and dry, while the storm began to truly howl through the trees outside. Around 8 p.m., the wind shifted, and the house began to groan and creak as it took the brunt of the gusts coming off the open fields to the north. I decided to take a break and walk to the kitchen, my socks sliding slightly on the polished hardwood floors. I filled the kettle, the sound of the running water echoing in the empty room, and I found myself glancing toward the laundry room door. It was ajar, just a sliver of blackness showing, and I could have sworn I'd closed it before sitting down to work. I pushed it shut, hearing the click of the latch, and told myself the wind must have sucked it open through the vents. The kettle started to whistle, a high-pitched, lonely sound that seemed to cut through the heavy air of the kitchen like a knife. I made a cup of chamomile tea, hoping the warmth would settle the strange, low-level anxiety that had started to prickle at the back of my neck. I stood by the counter for a moment, staring at the dark reflection of the kitchen in the window over the sink, seeing nothing but my own tired eyes. The lights flickered then, just a quick dip in power that made the refrigerator hum a lower, more ominous note for a few seconds. I brushed it off as typical for this part of the county during a storm, but I felt a sudden urge to check the locks on the front door. The deadbolt was thrown, the heavy oak door feeling solid and secure against the chaos happening on the other side. I walked back to the den, feeling a bit foolish for my jumpiness, and sat back down to finish the last few columns of my report. That was when I heard the first sound that didn't belong, a soft, wet thud from the back deck, like someone had dropped a heavy, soaked sponge onto the wood. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, listening so hard that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. It didn't repeat, so I forced myself to breathe, blaming it on a fallen branch or perhaps a stray trash can lid that had blown over the fence. 10 minutes later, the lights flickered again, but this time they stayed off for a full 5 seconds before surging back to life with a pop. I realized then that the storm was getting much worse, and the localized flooding warnings I'd seen earlier were probably more serious than I'd thought. I decided to save my work and shut down the computer, not wanting to risk a surge frying my power supply. As the monitors went black, the room suddenly felt much larger and significantly colder, the darkness from the corners creeping inward. I reached for my phone, but I'd left it charging in the kitchen, so I had to navigate the hallway by memory and touch. The air in the hallway felt thick, almost humid, which was strange because the air conditioning had been running all evening. I reached the kitchen and saw the green light of the charger, but as I reached for it, the power went out completely. This wasn't a flicker. This was the kind of deep, absolute darkness that makes you feel like you've been buried alive. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking just enough to make the charging cable difficult to detach from the port. I finally got it free and swiped to turn on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom like a searchlight in a fog. I panned the light around the kitchen, seeing the familiar shapes of my toaster, the fruit bowl, and the half-empty teacup I'd left on the counter. Everything looked normal, but the silence that had replaced the hum of the appliances was deafening, broken only by my own ragged breathing. I started walking back toward the living room, the beam of my light bouncing off the walls and creating flickering shadows that seemed to jump and hide. I stopped near the sliding glass patio door, the one that leads out to the wooden deck and the dark woods beyond. I've always hated that door at night because it feels like a giant, unblinking eye looking into my private life. I shone the light toward it, making sure the security bar was in place, which it was, wedged firmly into the track. But then I noticed something on the floor. A small, dark puddle of water right at the base of the door. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest as I leaned down to inspect it, thinking the seal on the door might have finally failed. The water wasn't just a puddle. It was a smear, a messy trail that looked like something wet had been dragged across the floor. I followed the trail with my light, seeing it lead away from the door and toward the dark opening of the hallway I just walked through. I felt a sudden, cold realization that I wasn't alone in the house, a thought so terrifying that my brain tried to reject it instantly. I told myself it was just a leak, that the rain was blowing in through a gap I couldn't see, but the smear looked too deliberate. I stood up, my knees feeling weak, and turned the light back toward the sliding glass door to see if I could find the source of the water. Just as I did, a massive bolt of lightning cracked directly overhead, illuminating the entire backyard in a brilliant, terrifying white light. In that split second I saw it. A face was pressed flat against the glass, right at eye level. The skin was a sickly, translucent white, and the eyes were wide, bulging, and staring directly into mine with an intense, vacant focus. But it was the mouth that stayed with me. A wide, horrific grin that showed too many teeth, stretched far past the point of being humanly possible. The person, or whatever it was, wasn't trying to hide. They were leaning into the glass, their nose flattened against the pane. I screamed, a raw, guttural sound that didn't even feel like it came from my own throat, and I scrambled backward until I hit the kitchen island. The darkness returned instantly as the lightning faded, leaving me blinded by the afterimage of that terrible, grinning face. I scrambled for my phone, which I dropped on the floor, my fingers clawing at the wood until I felt the cold glass of the screen. I turned the light back toward the door, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might actually burst through my ribs. The deck was empty, nothing but the driving rain and the shadows of the trees whipping back and forth in the wind. I didn't wait to see if they would come back. I bolted for the front door, my only thought being to get to my car and drive until I found people. I reached the front door and grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge, the lock feeling like it had been welded shut. I yanked and kicked at it, sobbing now, the terror turning into a frantic, mindless panic. I turned the light of my phone back toward the hallway, expecting to see the grinning man standing there, waiting for me. Instead, the hallway was empty, but the door to the laundry room, which I had closed and latched, was standing wide open again. I heard a sound then, a soft, wet shuffling coming from inside the laundry room, accompanied by that same metallic smell I'd noticed earlier. I realized then that the face I'd seen at the glass wasn't someone trying to get in. It was a reflection. The lightning had hit at just the right angle to show me what was standing in the kitchen with me, right behind my shoulder. The person had been inside the whole time, watching me work, watching me make tea, waiting for the lights to go out. I threw myself against the front window, shattering the glass with a heavy decorative vase I grabbed from the side table. I didn't care about the cuts. I scrambled through the broken frame and fell onto the wet grass, the rain instantly soaking my clothes. I ran for my car, fumbling with my keys, and didn't look back until I was miles away at a gas station under the bright, fluorescent lights. When the police finally went to the house an hour later, they found the sliding door locked and the security bar still in place. There was no one in the house, no sign of forced entry, and no footprints in the mud outside the back deck. But they did find one thing that made the lead officer look at me with a face full of pity and confusion. On the inside of the sliding glass door at eye level, there were two perfect, wet palm prints and a smear of saliva where a mouth had been pressed against the glass. They also found my cat, Jasper, curled up in the laundry room, unhurt but staring fixedly at the corner of the ceiling. I never went back to that house to live. I had a moving company pack my things while I stayed in a hotel. I live in a high-rise now, where the walls are concrete and the windows don't open more than a few inches. But sometimes, when it's raining particularly hard, I find myself staring at my reflection in the dark windows of my living room. And for a fleeting second, I see that wide, toothy grin reflecting back at me, just an inch behind my own head. I tell myself it's just the trauma, a lingering trick of the mind brought on by the sound of the rain. But then I smell that metallic scent of old pennies, and I realize I haven't looked at the reflection in my own eyes for months. The police never found the man, and they eventually closed the case, calling it an attempted home invasion by an unknown subject. But I know better because I saw the way that face looked at me, with a kind of recognition that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't a stranger looking for a place to rob. It was something that had been waiting for the right Tuesday night. And now, every time the power flickers, I hold my breath and wait for the lightning to show me where it's hiding this time. Because the worst part isn't that someone was in my house. It's the realization that they never actually left. They're just waiting for the next storm, for the next time I'm alone in the dark, feeling safe. Moving into the suburban rental on the edge of the woods seemed like the right move for someone who valued silence above all else. The house was an older split level with a damp, unfinished basement that smelled faintly of cedar and cold, stagnant earth. I spent most of my afternoons working from the kitchen table, while my golden retriever, Buster, spent his time oscillating between the patch of sun in the living room and the bottom of the cellar stairs. He was an incredibly gentle creature, the kind of dog who would shy away from a stray cat, so I never paid much attention when he'd trot down into the dark to nap. It was a Tuesday evening when the first shift in the atmosphere occurred, a subtle change that felt more like a drop in barometric pressure than anything tangible. Buster had gone down for his usual routine, but instead of the quiet thud of him settling onto the rug, I heard a sharp, aggressive snort. I paused my typing, my ears pricking up as a low, rumbling growl vibrated through the floorboards beneath my feet. It sounded like he was warning someone off, but I was the only person with a key to this property. I called his name, my voice sounding thin and hollow in the expansive, empty house, but he didn't come running. Instead, the growling intensified, escalating into a jagged, frantic bark that I had never heard him emit in all the years we had been together. I stood up, feeling a prickle of irritation rather than fear, and walked toward the basement door to let him out. The stairs were narrow and wooden, groaning rhythmically under my weight as I descended into the subterranean chill. The air down here always felt heavier, like a wet blanket pressing against my skin, but tonight it felt suffocatingly dense. Buster was backed into the far corner near the old water heater, his hackles raised into a stiff, dark ridge along his spine. He wasn't looking at me, but was instead fixed on the jagged shadow cast by a stack of old cardboard boxes in the recessed corner. I clicked the overhead light, but the bulb flickered once with a sickly, yellow hum, and then died completely, leaving me in the dim twilight filtering from the top of the stairs. Buster's barking became a jagged, rhythmic roar, his teeth bared in a way that made my stomach turn with genuine alarm. I took a hesitant step forward, reaching for my phone to use the flashlight, my fingers trembling slightly as I fumbled with the screen. Why was he acting like this over a pile of trash? I wondered, my logical brain trying to override the sudden, icy dread creeping up my neck. I stepped closer, squinting into the gloom, trying to discern if a stray animal had somehow found its way inside through a gap in the foundation. Buster lunged forward, snapping at the air, his growls vibrating with a primal, desperate intensity that seemed entirely out of character. I pointed my phone light directly at the corner, expecting to see a raccoon or perhaps a particularly large rat caught in the clutter. The beam cut through the dust motes, illuminating nothing but the damp concrete walls and the frayed edges of the cardboard. I let out a sharp, relieved laugh, telling Buster to calm down, but he didn't stop, his tail tucked tight between his legs as he continued to snap at the empty void. Then the silence returned, dropping over the basement like a heavy shroud, so abrupt that my ears started to ring. The dog didn't retreat, though. He stayed frozen, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something far beyond the range of human hearing. I took one more step into the corner, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand, tracing the edges of the floorboards where they met the stone foundation. There was nothing there, just the quiet decay of an old house that had been neglected for far too long. I reached out to grab Buster's collar to pull him away, my skin crawling with the sudden realization that the temperature in that specific corner was freezing, a localized pocket of winter. As my hand brushed the dog's damp fur, a sound emerged from the darkness. Not a growl, not a bark, but a soft, rhythmic intake of breath. It was human, moist and heavy, coming from the space directly behind the water heater where I had just been pointing my light. My pulse hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, as I realized the sound was coming from a height that suggested someone was crouched, waiting. I didn't turn around to run, because I knew that if I did, I would be exposing my back to the shadows that had been watching me the entire time. A voice, rasping and dry as dead leaves, whispered a single word that I barely understood, a name that sounded like my own but distorted and stretched by years of disuse. The dog whimpered, a high-pitched sound of pure, unadulterated terror, and he bolted up the stairs, his claws scrambling frantically against the wood. I stayed, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the moment, my phone light fixed on the darkness that seemed to be actively inhaling the light I offered it. The breathing stopped, and I heard the unmistakable metallic scrape of a folding chair being pushed back against the concrete. Something shifted in the corner, a slow, deliberate movement of fabric and bone that suggested a person standing to their full height. I finally found my legs, backing away step by step, the floorboards screaming under my frantic retreat as I scrambled for the stairs. I made it to the top and slammed the basement door, sliding the bolt home with shaking fingers. But the house didn't feel safe anymore. I grabbed my keys, the dog already waiting by the front door, his body shivering as he paced in tight, frantic circles. I didn't bother with shoes or my wallet, just grabbed the dog and shoved him into the car, my heart echoing the heavy thud of the basement door. As I pulled out of the driveway, I looked back at the house, half expecting to see a face pressed against the kitchen window. The lights were all off, just as I had left them, but the cellar window, the one I knew I had locked, was swung wide open, flapping rhythmically in the rising wind. I drove for miles until the gas light flickered, never once checking the rearview mirror, but I couldn't shake the sensation that the back seat was still cold. I am sitting in a motel parking lot now, the dog curled in a ball at my feet, refusing to look at the door. Every time the wind blows, I hear that soft, wet intake of breath in my ear, and I realize the lock on my room door is just a thin piece of brass that wouldn't hold a child, let alone what I felt breathing in the dark. I don't know how long I can stay awake, but I keep checking the corners of the room, and I keep seeing the shadows shifting just behind the curtain. The silence is the worst part, because I know that if I listen closely enough, I will hear the floorboards of the motel room start to creak. The humidity in the apartment was that thick, clingy kind that makes you feel like you're wearing your clothes instead of just putting them on. So I'd spent most of the evening draped over my old corduroy sofa, with the ceiling fan whirring uselessly overhead. It was one of those quiet Tuesday nights where the only sound is the occasional rhythmic thump of the washing machine in the basement, and the distant, muffled sound of a neighbor's dog barking at nothing in particular. I had the TV off because I wanted to save on the electric bill after the summer heat wave, leaving the living room bathed in the dull, orange glow of the street lamp filtering through the half-closed blinds. I remember picking at a loose thread on my cushion, my mind drifting through a dozen meaningless thoughts about work tomorrow and whether I had enough milk for breakfast. The silence was almost meditative, until it was interrupted by the sharp, high-pitched mechanical chirp of my smart TV powering itself on. I didn't think much of it at first because the remote was wedged somewhere under my hip, and I assumed I had just rolled onto the power button in my lethargy. I reached down to fish it out from the crevice of the cushions, expecting to see the colorful home screen of some streaming app I'd left open. Instead, the screen stayed black for several seconds, the backlight bleeding out from the edges in a faint, ghostly gray that made the dark room feel even smaller. I pressed the home button a few times, but the interface was unresponsive, frozen on that empty, backlit void. I figured it was just another one of those firmware updates that modern electronics seem to do at the most inconvenient times without asking for permission. I tossed the remote onto the coffee table inside, closing my eyes and letting my head fall back against the sofa. Just as I was about to drift off into a light doze, I heard a soft clicking sound coming from the TV speakers, like someone tapping a fingernail against a plastic microphone. I opened my eyes and saw that the screen had finally changed. But it wasn't a menu or a movie trailer. It was a video feed, grainy and slightly desaturated, showing a very familiar room with a very familiar person sitting on a sofa. It took my brain a solid 5 seconds to process that I was looking at the back of my own head. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest, the kind of physical sensation that makes you feel like the air has been sucked out of the room. The perspective of the camera was high up, tucked away in the corner of the ceiling where the wall meets the kitchen doorway, an angle that shouldn't have existed. I sat perfectly still, my eyes locked on the screen, watching the version of myself on the TV sit perfectly still in perfect synchronization. I raised my left hand slowly, my fingers trembling, and watched the pixelated figure on the screen mirror the movement with a half-second delay. This wasn't some pre-recorded prank or a sophisticated hack of my social media photos. This was happening right now, in this apartment. I looked toward the corner of the ceiling where the camera had to be, but all I saw was the shadow cast by the crown molding and a small, dusty cobweb. There was no visible lens, no blinking red light, and no wires running down the drywall. My breath started coming in short, jagged bursts as I realized that if the camera was where the screen said it was, whoever installed it had to have been inside while I was sleeping or at work. I stood up, my knees feeling like they were made of water, and the figure on the screen stood up too, looking small and vulnerable in the wide-angle lens. I walked toward the TV, thinking maybe I could unplug it or find some way to kill the signal. But as I got closer, the feed shifted. It didn't just stay on that one angle. It cut to a different view, this one much lower, seemingly coming from the vents of the air conditioning unit near the floor. Now I was looking at my own feet and the underside of the coffee table, a perspective that felt incredibly invasive and predatory. I felt a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck, the kind of chill that has nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I reached behind the TV stand, fumbling for the power cord, my fingers brushing against the thick layers of dust and the tangled mess of HDMI cables. When I finally yanked the plug out, the screen didn't go black immediately. It flickered once, then displayed a single line of text in a plain, white font. It said, "I like it better when you don't move." The TV finally died, the light vanishing and leaving me in the oppressive darkness of the living room. I stood there in the silence, the blood rushing in my ears like the sound of a distant ocean. Every little creak of the floorboards above me, and every sigh of the settling house felt like a physical blow to my senses. I realized then that the cameras weren't in the TV itself, but the TV was just the monitor someone was using to show me they were watching. I slowly turned around, scanning the darkness of the kitchen and the hallway that led to my bedroom, my eyes straining to catch any hint of movement. My phone was still on the sofa, and I realized I had to get to it to call for help. But the thought of moving through the open space felt impossible. I felt like a bug pinned to a board, exposed from every angle by hidden eyes I couldn't see. I started to back away toward the front door, keeping my eyes fixed on the shadows, my hand reaching out to feel for the wall to guide me. My fingers brushed against a small, hard bump on the wallpaper that I had never noticed before, right at eye level. It was the size of a pinhead, a tiny glass aperture embedded directly into the drywall, staring back at me with a cold, mechanical indifference. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated panic and bolted for the sofa to grab my phone, my feet thudding heavily on the hardwood. I grabbed the device and fumbled with the biometric lock, my thumb sliding uselessly over the sensor because of the sweat. When the screen finally lit up, it wasn't my wallpaper that appeared, but a notification from my home security app. Notification was a series of motion alerts, all of them time-stamped over the last 20 minutes. I opened the app, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone on the floor. The first alert showed me sitting on the sofa, just like the TV had, but the most recent one was different. It was a thumbnail image of the hallway leading to my bedroom, taken only 30 seconds ago. In the bottom corner of the frame, there was a sliver of a face peeking out from behind the doorframe of my closet. It wasn't a mask or a ghost. It was a man, his skin pale and sallow, with wide, unblinking eyes that seemed to be looking directly at the camera lens. He was smiling, a thin, tight-lipped expression that didn't reach his eyes, and he held a finger up to his lips in a universal gesture for silence. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like it was trying to break through the bone. The bedroom door was only 10 feet away from where I stood, and it was cracked open just enough for someone to be standing right behind it. I didn't hear a sound, no breathing, no shifting of weight, just the oppressive, heavy silence of the apartment. I knew I couldn't run for the front door because I'd have to turn my back on that hallway, and I couldn't stay here because he was already watching me. My phone vibrated in my hand, a new text message appearing from an unknown number at the top of the screen. I didn't want to look at it, but my eyes moved of their own accord, reading the words before I could stop myself. It said, "You looked so peaceful while you were sleeping this afternoon." I felt a wave of nausea roll over me as I remembered the hour-long nap I'd taken after work, completely oblivious to the person standing over me. I realized then that he wasn't just watching me tonight. He had been here for a long time, weaving himself into the fabric of my daily life. The cameras were everywhere, the vents, the walls, the smoke detectors, turning my sanctuary into a glass box. I took a step back, my heel catching on the edge of the rug, and I stumbled, nearly falling over the coffee table. The noise seemed deafening in the stillness, a sharp crack of wood that echoed through the small space. From the darkness of the hallway, I heard a soft, dry chuckle, a sound so human and so malevolent that it made my skin crawl. It wasn't the sound of a monster. It was the sound of a man who was enjoying a game he had already won. I backed into the kitchen, my hand groping for the knife block on the counter, my fingers closing around the handle of a steak knife. It felt pathetic and small in my hand, a tiny sliver of steel against an invisible, omnipresent threat. I didn't turn on the lights because I didn't want to see him, but I knew he could see me perfectly in the dark through those infrared lenses. I watched the bedroom door, waiting for it to swing open, waiting for the shadow to resolve into a person. The door didn't move, but I heard the faint sound of clicking again, coming from the speakers of the TV I had unplugged. Even without power, the speakers were emitting a low, rhythmic static, and beneath that, a voice whispered my name. It was my own voice, a recording of me talking to myself earlier in the day, played back at a slightly slower speed. The voice was repeating the mundane things I'd said. "Where are my keys? I need to do the dishes." It was a psychological vivisection, a way of showing me that even my most private, boring moments were his property. I felt a tear prick at the corner of my eye, not from sadness, but from the sheer, overwhelming terror of being completely known by a stranger. I looked down at my phone again, hoping to see the 911 operator's screen, but the screen was black again. A small icon appeared in the center of the display, a camera lens with a red line through it. He had cut the signal, or maybe he was using a jammer he'd installed weeks ago while I was at the grocery store. I was totally alone, trapped in a maze of my own belongings with a man who knew every inch of the layout. I could feel him watching me right now, probably judging the way I was shaking, the way I was holding the knife. I wondered if he was disappointed that I'd found the cameras, or if this was the part of the night he'd been looking forward to the most. I heard a floorboard creak, not in the hallway, but directly behind me, near the refrigerator. I spun around, slashing the air with the knife, but there was no one there, just the hum of the appliance and the darkness. Then the TV screen flickered back to life, despite the cord lying coiled on the floor like a dead snake. It wasn't the living room feed this time. It was a close-up of my own face, captured from a camera hidden inside the TV's frame. I looked terrified, my eyes wide and shiny, my mouth hanging open in a silent scream. The text appeared on the screen again, scrolling slowly across my forehead. Turn around. I didn't want to. I fought the urge with every fiber of my being, but my body moved on instinct. I turned toward the window, and there, reflected in the glass against the night, I saw the closet door in the hallway slowly, silently swinging wide. A pair of boots stepped out into the light of the street lamp, followed by a hand that reached up to adjust a small, handheld monitor. The man didn't look at me. He looked at his screen, checking the framing of the shot, making sure the lighting was just right. He was documenting this, making a movie out of the worst moment of my life. I realized then that he didn't want to kill me, at least not yet. He wanted to own the experience of my fear. He finally looked up from the monitor, his eyes locking onto mine through the reflection in the window. He didn't move toward me. He just stood there, watching me watch him through a layer of glass and a dozen hidden lenses. I felt the knife slip from my sweaty grip and clatter onto the tile floor, the sound final and hollow. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small remote, pressing a button that made every light in the apartment turn on at once. The brightness was blinding, a white-hot explosion that forced me to squint and shield my eyes. When I could finally see again, the hallway was empty, the closet door was shut, and the apartment was silent. I ran to the front door and threw it open, sprinting out into the hallway and down the stairs without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the street, the cool night air hitting my face like a physical relief. I stood under a street lamp, chest heaving, looking up at the window of my third-floor apartment. The lights were still on, and for a second, I thought I saw a shadow move past the blinds. I reached for my phone to call the police, but when I pulled it out, the screen was active. It was the security app again, showing a live feed of the front door of the apartment building. I watched the screen as a man walked out of the lobby, his head down, wearing a jacket I recognized as my own. He walked past the very street lamp I was standing under, not even glancing in my direction. He kept walking until he disappeared around the corner, leaving me standing there in the middle of the sidewalk. I haven't gone back to the apartment, and the police found nothing when they searched it. No cameras, no wires, no evidence of an intruder. They told me the TV probably had a hardware malfunction, and that the stress of living alone was getting to me. But every time I walk past a window or see a dark corner in a room, I feel that same prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I know he's still out there, and I know he still has the footage, somewhere on a hard drive I'll never find. There is a video of me realize I am no longer alone, and sometimes, when I'm scrolling through my phone in a new, well-lit place, I see a notification that quickly disappears. It's a low battery warning for a device I don't own, somewhere close by.